history and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition after the Thanksgiving weekend. Hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving with your family, and certainly we will this week be looking at very important issues that affect your faith, your family, and your freedom. And I think you will certainly enjoy our interview in the first hour, but in the second hour, let me just mention, we're going to come back to this issue of affordability. In light of Thanksgiving, John Stossel has done a very good piece on Thanksgiving socialism, since that seems to be in the news, and actually is an upcoming issue in Outlook, so the issue of socialism will surface again. But also, as we get into the first day of December, we have a very good piece on the first Sunday of Advent, reminds us of hope. So it's a good way to end this second hour today. But in the first hour, going to be talking about this book, The Heart of Apostasy, and that is how the black church abandoned biblical authority for political ideology and how to reclaim it. It is written by Dr. Eric Wallace, who's been on the program with us many times before, and it connects up with some other things that we've done. As we've said, during this 250th anniversary of this country, we want to talk about America's godly heritage, but we also recognize there are some very dark chapters in American history, and one, of course, is the impact that this country has had on the African American individuals and on the church. Now, just the other day, we had Robert Woodson on to talk about his book, Red, White, and Black, and certainly some of the issues of the effects of the culture on the African American experience and some of the misinformation and myths about that. Today, we want to look at what's happening inside some black churches in that regard as well. So these two sort of go together. You can go and find that Wednesday interview with Robert Woodson, and then this one today with Eric Wallace. I think you will benefit from both of those. And even as we go through this and talk about some of the problems inside the black church, you might be thinking, well, there's a lot of these problems in the white church. Yes, we're going to get to those sooner or later, but today we're going to focus on this because of his book. Dr. Wallace is an individual who's been on the program with us before. He has undergraduate degrees in biblical studies, an MA, a THM, and a PhD, as well as was the first African American to earn a PhD in biblical studies from what today is now called Union Presbyterian Seminary. Individual that has been with us before to talk about everything from race relations, critical race theory, and the rest. Back in 2011, he and his wife co-founded Freedom's Journal Institute for the study of faith and public policy, and really since 2020 has hosted Kingdoms in Conflict, a matter of faith, race, and public policy. So, Dr. Eric Wallace, welcome back to Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Let's go back to the year 2000. You were trying to get your PhD, and you were assigned a paper that you did, I think, probably a little unwillingly, on the Gospel of Luke. But you have said that that was a supplemental assignment. But as you went through the Gospel of Luke, it seems like some lights went on, and a quarter of a century later, this book, I think, is the fruit of some of that, isn't it?
Absolutely. It was so I got to talk about my failing an exam. Huh? It's in the book anyway. Yeah. So working on your as you're going through, before you can get to your dissertation, you have to take these exams. You got to do 5 exams in two weeks, and you study for those. And then once you say yes, there is no stopping. I mean, you take one exam, then you go a couple of days, and you take another exam, and on. And I flunked one on the Synoptic Gospels, even though the funny thing was my dissertation was on the Gospel of John. But as you know, that's not part of the Synoptics.
That's right.
John is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
I just wasn't prepared for what was coming at me. And so when I flunked it, they said I needed to do a supplemental paper. And in doing that paper, it opened my eyes into the Gospel of Luke, saw things I had never seen before. Because I had kind of, a lot of folks think the Synoptic Gospels, they're all saying basically the same thing. And to some extent, yeah, from you go really high altitude and you look down at the Gospels and you say, yeah, okay, it talks about Jesus, it talks about his life, it talks about his death and resurrection. But there are other things that are going on in the text that if you're not if you're not aware, you're not picking up on these things. And so one of the things I found out was there was a theme in there called promise and fulfillment, where God has promised a number of things and they're starting to become fulfilled. God is moving in human history now, and Luke is writing to Theophilus. Now, we still haven't figured out exactly who Theophilus is. There are a number of things out there that people are suggesting. I don't get into all of that. I just try and say he's speaking to his community, and the community is wondering, when is Jesus going to return? Because they're looking at their watches and their calendars, and they're thinking, he just left here not too long ago. We thought he'd be right back to take us on to glory. But it wasn't happening that way. There's a delay. In fact, we're still waiting for his return.
Right.
And so the thought was, Luke is writing to assure Theophilus that what happened needed to happen, and God is in the process fulfilling his promises. And not only does he fulfill his promises, but if God makes a promise, such as Jesus returning, Jesus will return. And it's the only gospel that details his ascension as well. In the end of the gospel, Jesus ascends, and at the beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus ascends. So letting the church know that as he ascended, he will surely return in the way in which he went up, he'll come back down. And it's a promise and so the question is, what do we do in the meantime? And so I use that paper for this book to talk about what the church should be doing in the meantime, just like the early church. What are we supposed to be doing? I think Luke kind of lays it out for us.
Well, and again, we're going to take a break, but I might just mention when we come back from the break that you break this down. This would be not only a good book, as we're going to be talking about some of the real problems of whether it is the adoption of certain kinds of ideologies and philosophies like social justice or critical race theory or whatever. It's also just a great kind of commentary on Luke, because you have a section on Luke 1 to 4, a section on Luke 5 to 8, a whole section here about some of the parables, and in some respects, I right now am preaching through and teaching in my Sunday school class, Mark, but if I were doing Luke, I'd be borrowing heavily from you. And even we had an interview the other day with somebody who did some sections on just Luke 1 and 2, which I'm like, well, those are the ones we tend to talk about during the Christmas season, but brought out so many good ideas. When we come back, though, I want to maybe have you talk about, okay, we know in some respects by what the church should do, by what it should avoid, and some of that has to do with social justice. Some of it has to do with this idea of white supremacy. Some of it has to do with the cultural loyalty and a variety of other things, including what you call doublethink. So again, this is a book that I think you're going to find very fascinating. We need to go to a break, and we're talking today with Eric Wallace, The Heart of Apostasy. And as we go through this, you find yourself saying, okay, I'd kind of like to read that book myself. We have information about it on the website, and that's a way in which, if you would like to get a copy of it, you can get it, of course, in hardcover or Kindle and paperback. So all sorts of ways you can obtain that. Let's take a break, though. We'll continue our conversation on the heart of apostasy right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One economic indicator that investors and average Americans consider is the nation's debt-to-GDP ratio. In previous commentaries, I've documented that once nations have surpassed 130% debt-to-GDP ratio, they eventually defaulted. I decided to dig a little deeper. I found that since 1800, there have been 51 out of 52 countries with a debt-to-GDP ratio this high that have defaulted. This was through restructuring, devaluation, high inflation, or outright default. Japan was the only exception in the past, but it's also fair to say that the U.S. is not that Japan, and even Japan today is not that Japan. Why am I talking about this now? Well, first, the current debt to GDP ratio is 125%. But it's worth noting that the ratio was over 130% in the second quarter of 2020 during the pandemic. Second, the U.S. debt is increasing faster than our economy. And a third reason is what happens today. The Federal Reserve has announced that it will end quantitative tightening on December 1st. It has been reducing its balance sheet. It is now going to pivot to quantitative easing, and that will likely begin to buy assets to increase the money supply. Let's go back to these historical examples. The odds aren't good for the U.S. since 98% of countries defaulted with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 130% or more. Now consider the fact that we just come off the longest government shutdown in American history because some in Congress wanted the government to spend more money on enhanced subsidies to Obamacare. Welcome to congressional irresponsibility. We're on the edge of a fiscal cliff, and many in Congress want to spend even more. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Conversation today with Dr. Eric Wallace as we talk about his book, The Heart of Apostasy. And Eric, for just a minute, I guess we should go back to some key verses. And one of those occurs to me is Colossians 2:8, where we're told that we should see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow or deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition or elementary spiritual forces of the world rather than on Christ. We should not be conformed, if we want to use another passage in Romans 12, to this world. And this is a problem for the white church, the Asian church, certainly the black church that you're talking about here, that sometimes we have the culture condition the church. And you make the argument that in many cases in the black church, politics has taken over the pulpit. Can you explain?
Yeah, where people are so concerned about racial issues that they have people even come in and I'm not necessarily against having people say something in church, right? It's just that it is so one-sided that they're concerned about issues that really have nothing to do with biblical. So instead of talking about the social issues, like we say marriage and abortion and things like that, they're only concerned with continuing the civil rights movement, which I actually thought was over, right, with the civil rights legislation. So they're acting as though with every election, you know, as a former president once said, if you don't vote for, if you don't vote for me, you're not black, and if you don't vote the Democrat Party, they're gonna put you back in chains. So, I thought all that was taken care of with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and so the church ends up. So there was when the Democrat convention was here in Chicago. So I'm right outside Chicago. They had this thing called the Black Church Pact, and the Black Church Pact was about voting for people who shared these particular three things that they really wanted to talk about, which was mass incarceration, gun violence, and voter suppression. Now I was incredulous when I read that because I'm thinking, where's the outrage about family formation? We don't have we don't have black couples getting married anymore. It's under 39% now.
Wow. And
fatherless homes. Where are we going to talk about that? And how about education? The school systems are letting our kids down. They can't read, write, or do arithmetic. And then entrepreneurship. No, they want to talk about mass incarceration. Well, if black kids are running around shooting people and stealing cars and all the crime we see, especially in the city of Chicago, then they deserve to be put in jail. Right? Gun violence. It's not gun violence. Guns don't shoot themselves. This is gang violence. We need to do something about gangs. They don't have it labeled right. I'm sorry. I'm really passionate about this one. And then when it comes to voter suppression, that's basically just talking about voter IDs. Now, if you ask most black people say we have IDs, right? We have the identification. So what is this whole thing about? You're trying to suppress voters by saying you can't vote unless you can identify yourself. Most people think that's one of the stupidest things in the world. We have IDs. You need IDs for work. You need IDs to bank. You need IDs to get on an airplane. I mean, come on. So it's really quite stupid. Yet they're pushing this ideology that we need to vote for these particular black people, and we need to definitely vote for the Democrat Party because it's the Democrat Party that cares for black people, right?
Unless you happen to be the wrong particular attitude or representation. I know you ran for the Illinois State Senate before, but you mentioned the Black Church PAC, a prophetic voice or political pawn. But right next to it in your book, you also talk about Black Lives Matter. And so talk about that, because that has had even a greater impact, I would think, for many of our listeners than even the so-called Black Church PAC, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, it has, and it goes to the point of, this is a section where I talk about different voices, a divided heart. So we're allowing voices from outside the church speak to the church, and it shouldn't. The churches, I think you kind of mentioned this in introducing this section, that we should be speaking to the culture and being cultural. And the problem is, it's like anytime something happens to one black person, it's like it's supposed to happen to everybody. See, this is evidence that there's still racism out here. If a white cop arrests a black person or shoots them or what have you, so you have Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and others where they were involved with the police, but they never asked the question whether the content, it was because of the color of their skin or the content of their character that got them in trouble. And I want to say it's mostly because of the content of their character that they ended up getting arrested. You know, George Floyd, he was actually high when he got arrested. And so, but Black Lives Matter started, because of Trayvon, but they're not even a Christian group. We know that two of the people that made that up were or are lesbians. And Patrice Cullors did a interview where she was talking about how say their names and hashtags were actually a way of, so they do ancestral worship. And so they call upon the dead to get involved with the things that they're doing. So they were actually conjuring up the dead spirits of those people that had died to take part in their protest. And what are church people doing involved with that? I mean, we're so quick to jump on the bandwagon that anything about race, we're running out there to be a part of this. Because, heaven knows there's still a bunch of races out there. As Black Lives Matter people said, we step outside and we don't know what's going to happen because, white people everywhere are looking to take, send us to jail and stuff. I'm being a little facetious, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, but part of the issue is, as you point out, these ideas make their way into the church. And one other one you talk about is the whole DEI ideology, which I'm starting to sense a little bit of a pushback, but that affects the way in which we look at everything from gender to race to even the whole issue of religious liberty, which we'll be talking about on Friday with Kelly Shackelford and some of the people with First Liberty Institute. So these ideas have an impact far beyond just the black church. They have a way in which they are different ways to view the world. And as you point out, as Christians, we should try to be thinking biblically about these issues, not taking ideas that sometimes come from what you refer to as kind of the next generation Marxism.
Yeah, I mean, we're buying wholesale the black church because of our history. Now, I understand, but this is not 1950. It's not the 40s. There's no Jim Crow. I mean, white supremacy has been wiped out. White supremacy, I say, is a myth in my book, but it's used, Jim Crow was used to try and subjugate black people, right? And someone could say later on in slavery, because black people weren't made slaves because they were blacks. They were made slaves because they were available, and they were sold by other blacks in Africa and put on ships and sent here. They tried to enslave other people. They tried to enslave whites, so they tried to enslave Indians, and this just didn't work out. But it wasn't because they were black. It's because they were available. Now, the racism later came in, but, we have a bad history, right? But we can't pretend as though it's, like I said, 1950s. It's 2000. It's the 2000s now. It's the 21st century. And a lot of this stuff has been wiped out. There is, if you believe, one of the things I want to challenge the church, especially the black church, if you believe in white supremacy, then what does that say about who you think God is? Right? Are white people stronger than God to be able to hold you back or to keep you from doing something? I ask people today, what is it that white people can do that black people can't do? I don't know what it is. You need to show me. We've had black presidents, black vice presidents. We got senators. We got congressmen. We've got governors. We've got, baseball players, basketball players. I mean, there used to be a time there was hardly ever any black quarterbacks. These days, it's hard to find a team without a black quarterback. I mean, what is it that we're lagging behind in?
That's a good point. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some other aspects, because you do talk about particular conventions, denominations, and other things, which are part of the book as well. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But as we go to a break, let me just mention that tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. And if you receive an email from me, we sent that out this morning, and you should have it in your inbox. Just reminding you, tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. This is an opportunity for you to certainly, I would hope you consider supporting Point of View, but also I would highly encourage you to think about supporting other Christian organizations that are near to you as well. It could be the Christian radio station that you're listening to right now. It could be a Christian ministry. Ministries depend on financial support, especially as we're coming to year end. And I think Giving Tuesday is a great opportunity for us to encourage you to be generous with your giving to, first of all, Point of View, as well as to other organizations. And of course, we assume you're already giving to your church and other organizations, but a special day set aside for giving, I think it's a really great idea. Wanted to remind you of that opportunity. And you don't have to wait till tomorrow. We have a button where you can click on it right now and give and be part of that particular goal that we have. We'll be back right after this.
No doubt you've seen the headlines and heard Kerby talking about Gen Z leading church attendance. It is so exciting to see young adults seeking truth. But there are a lot of lies that are competing for their attention and their hearts. The good news is you can give Americans the gift of truth. Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday, the perfect opportunity to make an intentional impact through your generosity. Every day, Point of View brings biblical truth to people across the nation and around the world, and your generous support is what makes that happen. Will you partner with Point of View this Giving Tuesday and give the gift of truth to a seeking nation? Don't forget to make your gift tomorrow or give anytime by visiting pointofview.net. Or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. Again, Giving Tuesday coming tomorrow, but you can give right now at pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Eric M. Wallace. The book is entitled Heart of Apostasy. A number of people that we've interviewed on this program have said some very nice things about it. For example, Ken Blackwell, who's currently now with the Family Research Council, talks about the fact that Eric Wallace confronts the cultural and political ideologies that have subtly yet powerfully undermined the church's prophetic witness. The book is an authentic call to reclaim biblical fidelity in the age of compromise. Some very good comments by Corey Brooks. Also, I might just mention Troy Jackson puts it this way. He said, this book is a fearless line-in-the-sand rebuke against political idolatry and the seduction of social justice that has replaced the gospel in too many pulpits. Wallace masterfully exposes the false gospels of racial grievance, cultural conformity, and critical race theory while pointing us towards repentance, restoration, and kingdom allegiance. And in some respects, you have written a book which many people have said is not just a critique, but it's really a roadmap for renewal. And as you work your way through, you find that you give us quotes from a variety of other sources showing that, yes, we have had situations in the past where individuals have spoken prophetically. You have, for example, the letter from the Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King, Christian Manifesto from Dr. Francis Schaeffer, the Manhattan Declaration, something we've talked about with Os Guinness. So in some respects, you can't solve a problem until you identify what the problem is, but you also really give us some suggestions on what we need to do to get back on track. Isn't that fair?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It wouldn't be fair for me to just talk about all the problems we have and then not suggest a remedy for any of it. And part of that is, do you want me to go there, or do you want me to?
Sure, I'd love to, because, in some respects, you take it through the Gospel of Luke, and I could see some pastors saying, you know what, we're going to study the Gospel of Luke, and then I'm going to be pulling all sorts of great insights from this book by Eric Wallace as we go through some of the text in Luke 1 through 4, and then 5 through 8, and the rest of the particular Gospel, because they're just great touch points that you provide in the book, aren't there?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, say after I wrote that paper, and after I realized how much it opened up my eyes, I ended up actually preaching through the Gospel of Luke as a pastor. I was pastoring a church. It's funny because I used to pray, and I used to be afraid to become a pastor. I'm trying to figure out, how do you preach every Sunday? How do you come up with a message? And it's like the Lord just spoke to me one day. He said, "Eric, just walk through the text."
That's right.
And I'm like, oh, that's right. That's what I learned in seminary.
Expository preaching. That's what we all leared in our seminary classes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Absolutely. But there was two things I wanted to share before we go to that. One of the things was, I was hoping you were going to mention critical race theory, because I call it the doctrine of demons.
Yes.
You've
written about that quite a bit, so go ahead.
Yeah. So, 1 Timothy 4, 1, where he talks about the latter times some will abandon the faith by following deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. And I'm not going to give it all away here, but there's stuff in there where critical race theory says, oh, you white people, you're defective and that you're racist, you're born racist, and there's really nothing you can do about it, right? And clearly that goes against Scripture. So part of my argument in this book is that we need to stop listening to people who don't know anything about Scripture, who aren't believers in the first place. And they're giving you ideologies that are antithetical to the text, that are at cross purposes with the Word of God. And we need to, and the other thing I wanted to say is that I'm not calling, because I've been accused of trying to make everybody, Republicans. And I say, no, the call is, the clarion call is to be members of the kingdom and be kingdom principled. Because should the Republican Party move away from some of the stances that it's taken, we won't vote for them either. So I don't vote for the Democrat Party because they've been so far to the left and so far with LGBT, with a number of other issues. I live in Illinois, and actually a lot of the when I first started getting involved with politics here in Illinois, a lot of the leadership in Illinois were quote moderate. They didn't like the fact that I was pro-life and wanted kids to actually learn, to have school choice and things like that. So there are no perfect parties, my friends. But our first loyalty is to the kingdom, and in order to know what God says is to read His Word and understand what it means and understand how to apply it. And I'm sorry, I forgot what you want me to talk about now.
Well, while we're on that for just a minute, because you were talking about with Black Lives Matter, some of the places where that comes from, because you're the expert in many cases on critical race theory, a lot of these ideas come from neo-Marxist thinkers that were in the so-called Frankfurt School. And to see some of those ideas making their way into the church today, those are voices which are antithetical, completely contrary to biblical ideas, aren't they?
Absolutely. And the funny thing about it, though, the hypocrisy is they'll talk about how Christianity is a white man's religion. And I want to remind people, Christianity came out of the Middle East, right? And it went down into Africa and other places, into India and then up, into Italy before it ever got to to the British Isles or to Spain or to wherever, and in Europe, before it was, Europe was Christianized, right? What we know, though, is whitewashed is the Frankfurt School. There were no black people at the Frankfurt School. All this stuff comes from white liberals, communists, who then exported to the United States, and we pick it up. And then you got black leaders such as James Cone, who also does the black liberation theology and starts bringing communism, into the church. And you have, if we're going to get into some of the excursus, you have I talk about the civil rights movement, Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And then I talk about in another excursus about the National Baptist Convention.
Mm-hmm. We'll do that because that was one of your sections there, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, because you say that's a case study in cultural compromise. Can you explain?
Well, what happens is you have the National Baptist Convention, which is, I think, the largest black denomination that there was at the time, and Dr. King and others are a part of this, but they wanted to change its focus. They wanted to start pushing social gospel and start using, I don't want to say it, to use certain tactics, direct action, where the leader of the National Baptist Convention wanted to use the courts and other methods, traditional methods in which to try and change what was going on. And actually, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, Joseph Jackson, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a friend of mine right now who's actually doing some stuff on Dr. King, by the way, Chad Jackson. I don't know if you've had him on your show, but somebody you need to have on your show. But he's got an MLK project, and he talks about how they end up having a fight on the floor and end up breaking up to the Progressive National Baptist Convention and the National Baptist Convention, because they broke up. They didn't want to. Joseph Jackson did not want to go that direction. And actually, when they were talking about doing the bus boycotts, Joseph Jackson said they were willing to buy the buses, right? But they didn't want to buy the buses because they wanted the conflict. See, they wanted to have conflict and protest. They did stuff on purpose to cause there to be strife, because communists wanted to be able to take over. They wanted to have a race war to take place so that, so the communists would come and be able to take over and start to spread its message. See, you're being oppressed. See how the white man is oppressing you? You need to do something about this. And so it was done on purpose, where there were other means. There are other ways in which certain things could have been done. So the civil rights movement, I talk about that a little bit. I talk about how, even though I quote Dr. King would not be, so I quote him in a section, I think, where I talk about a good and honest heart.
Mm-hmm.
He would be in the section that would be called a detached heart. He was not a Christian. He did not believe in the virgin birth. He did not believe in the deity of Christ. And there was one other that escapes me right now. But he wasn't a Christian. He didn't subscribe to Orthodox Christianity. He believed he could get inspiration from any religion, right? And so, and he went to a very, very liberal seminary, very liberal seminary. And was more interested in studying theology than he was in studying, I shouldn't say that, because as a biblical scholar, I didn't take a whole lot of theology, but I wanted to know what the text said. So I had to get in and take Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and all that stuff.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back because you have some RISE principles, and that is the road back to biblical authority. And I thought we might end with some of those positive steps that we can take. Talking about the book, The Heart of Apostasy, how the Black Church abandoned biblical authority for political ideology and how to reclaim it. Dr. Eric Wallace with us. We'll come back and talk about some of those significant principles right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Eric Wallace with us for a few more minutes. You know, for decades, the black church has really served as the moral compass for communities and really boldly proclaimed the truth, stood for justice, shaped the culture. But some of that legacy is under siege. And I thought, Eric, for just a minute, we might talk about, as you end the book, the RISE principles, R-I-S-E. And again, for people that like to take notes, just write R, and then I, then S, then E. The R stands for responsible government, and your argument is a good one, and that is that we have a government because of God's design. You can see that in Romans 13. You talk about the fact that the black church understood this. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., and others recognized that government should be accountable to God's moral law. So the first step is to have a responsible government, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Responsible government is fiscally disciplined, constitutionally bound, and morally accountable. Yes, sir. And the only way you can do that is have people who understand that actually run for office. That's why it's so important for Christians to get involved in politics.
Yes.
And not allow it to be run by people who have no scruples.
Well, again, R's for responsible government. The I stands for individual liberty and fidelity. And again, one of the verses you give us there is 1 Peter 2, verse 16, which reminds us that we are to live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as instruments of God. It does seem to me that we should talk about liberty, we should talk about freedom, but going hand in hand with that is responsibility. We have a whole generation saying, no, I want to be free to do anything I want. No, it's freedom within the bounds of moral principles. And the black church really at one time was the beacon of spiritual moral clarity. And you say it really needs to recover its voice.
Absolutely. As image bearers, we're accountable to God. But in order to have freedom, you must believe in some kind of moral, you have to have some kind of moral compass. All right, as I talk about it, sometimes guide rails on the side, so you don't go off into one, too far left or too far right on any particular thing, but that you're morally centered. But God gives us the freedom, as you said, not to do what we want, but to do what is right. One of the things when Moses is asking Pharaoh to let his people go, is let them go out and to be able to worship as they want to worship. We need the freedom to be able to worship as we want to worship, but also be able to live out our lives and do what God has called us to do, because everybody has a particular calling.
Might also mention these RISE principles are on YouTube, so you can find them too. But R, again, for responsible government. I, individual liberty and fidelity. The next one is S, and that's strong family values. And that brings us back to one that, Eric, you have already mentioned, but is certainly of concern. The breakdown of the black family in America is a crisis. And Frederick Douglass, I think, put it best, in which he said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And so obviously we need to speak to men and tell them to recapture the responsibility they have to raise up godly children. But this breakdown in the black family, and now the breakdown even in the white families, is a cultural crisis that we need to reverse, and the church needs to speak to that.
Absolutely. And too long, as we're busy either not speaking to certain issues or we're accepting them in silence. So when it comes to LGBTQ, a lot of pastors are now silent, and some are even moving to the point where it's okay. Gay marriage is all right. So what do we do now when we get to the P in pedophilia? Is it all right for adults to want to be with children? Come on. It's the family which God first instituted above all else. The family was instituted before the church. So the family is God's number one institution. He established it, male, female, and then he told them to go out and have children. So, if we're going to do this right, we know that marriage is between a man and a woman, and we're supposed to have children. There's no one in there about aborting our kids.
Yes. So again, R, I, and then S, of course, strong family values. And then E stands for economic empowerment. And that's where you would have some people say, well, that should be economic justice. But oftentimes that's just redistribution. What it is empowerment. And again, I love your quote from Booker T. Washington, who called for black students to pursue education, enterprise, and self-discipline, and instead of maybe embracing victimhood, recognizing that we do live in a free country, there are entrepreneurial opportunities, and so if you want to be successful, don't claim victimhood. Go out there and use your gifts, your talents in a way to make your life much better. And so that's the E for RISE, isn't it?
Absolutely. So the economic empowerment, this is where it differs from the left, calls for opportunity, not equal outcomes. And that's what DEI is talking about, equal outcomes, which we know is it is not possible to have equal outcomes because people are different. Even in families, I've got 2 other brothers, and we're all different. The things that we want to do or feel called to do or are good at, they're all different. So there's no way in the world we could have equal outcomes. It's just a non-starter.
Let me just mention that, first of all, people might want to contact you, and we have a couple of links. First of all, we have the Freedom's Journal Institute, and that's a place where you can find out a lot of information and see some of the articles that have been written, some of the videos that you have there, and those kinds of resources. So that's the first one. Of course, we have a link as well to both your Facebook link as well as to Twitter, or basically X. And then, of course, we have a link to the book. So if somebody wants to take some of this material and use it, we've given them some of the links, but I would imagine you're also available to come and speak and address some of those issues, aren't you?
Sure. Somebody can reach out to me, and email would probably be better, would be office@freedomsjournalinstitute.org, office@freedomsjournalinstitute.org, if they're interested in having me come out and speak, or just wanting to interact with me, via email. That would work.
Well, again, if people want to know more about some of the teaching and speaking you've done, some of the conferences that we've had you on talking about the Black community and how to reach out, all of that is available at our website at pointofview.net. And so, Eric, as always, appreciate you coming on the program once again, and thank you for writing the book and giving us some time to delve into it a little bit more detail.
Thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, let me just mention a couple of things. First of all, if you have said, I haven't heard that particular kind of interview before, I suspect that's because we really do like to get into some issues that we believe are important, sometimes controversial, and I recognize that, so that's why we wanted you to know about this particular book and resource. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to talk to Dr. Eric Wallace a little bit more, maybe connect, maybe have a dialogue with him, maybe interact with him on X or Facebook about some of these issues, that is all available. If you find yourself saying, well, I'm kind of interested in the book, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but probably not, because it is a book that is more tied to some of the things that he is doing in the Institute. We do have a link so that you can get it in hardcover, paperback, or even Kindle, and we have all those links on our website at pointofview.net. But as we go to a break, I hope you'll start thinking about what you might want to do even today. Don't have to wait till tomorrow, which is Giving Tuesday, to support this ministry. We have a goal of $15,000. It was the goal we had last year, and even though prices have gone up and our costs have gone up, we still have a relatively modest goal, but we are asking you to be one of those people to participate with us. And if you've appreciated some of the conversation that we've had even in the first hour, and many of the topics we're going to address in the second hour, I hope that you might go to the website right now. You'll see a banner that says Give Now. Of course, you can follow up on the email we sent out this morning. Let's take a break. We have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, we're going to spend some time looking at a number of different issues in the news, and every one of these articles that I'm mentioning is on the website at pointofview.net in case you would like to read them. And I might even issue a disclaimer, because this first article, do something about prices or you're going to lose. Now, he's writing it primarily to Republicans, but it's true for Democrats that are incumbents right now, because what is happening is this issue of affordability, which I think is a serious issue. I'm not discounting that. Unfortunately, some politicians are. This could be the decider in the next set of elections, not only in the midterm elections, but even in a future presidential election. So this is one of the reasons why I spend a fair amount of time talking about economic issues. My commentary today is, for example, about the debt ratio and some things which need to be addressed, both in terms of the macro scale, but also need to be addressed so that you have money for groceries and gas and rent and things of that nature. But I will admit, this first article by Derek Hunter, even though I appreciate some of the things he says, is a classic example of something that could be a lot shorter. I was watching a YouTube video the other day and noticed one of the comments said, this video would have been just as good if it was 10 minutes long. And I looked up and yeah, it was 17 minutes long. And I don't understand it, but I mean, here's somebody that rambles on for 2 paragraphs before he gets to a point that isn't even the title of the article. You have to go to about 5 paragraphs before we finally get to the point about doing something about the prices. But just before we get to the punchline, talk about burying the lead, as they say, he did make some interesting comments about the fact that right now most Americans are really certainly concerned about what's happening out on the streets and the fact that we have foreign criminals and the rest, and also points out that there have been all sorts of made-up stats, like, for example, that these people that are here from other countries commit fewer crimes than other Americans, which he points out is a made-up stat because, first of all, a lot of the blue states don't even allow you to collect the immigration status of those individuals, but also points out, I think, an intuitively obvious thing, that if a victim of illegal alien crime exists, it's only because that illegal alien was here in the first place. But anyway, he drones on for a while about this issue of illegal crimes, but makes the case that even as people may be upset about the open borders and about a variety of other things, elections oftentimes are won or lost on what are oftentimes called kitchen table issues affecting how you deal with the economy. And he says that the deciders in elections are the people who really don't buy into the hype of left or right. They just want to live their lives. But to do that, they need to be able to afford to do it. And when you can't feed or house yourself or your family, nothing else matters, no matter how much you care about what he's now spent time talking about for 5 paragraphs, are important issues, ones that we talk about here on Point of View. But again, he says that if you're hungry or afraid to be evicted because you can't afford rent, the border can wait. So he's trying to remind at least some of the individuals that might read his commentary that if you're a candidate for the next midterm elections, and recognize we're in those right now because some of you will be voting in the primaries in just another month or two, and we will even be talking about that on our Thursday program when we're going to talk about I voter, and so all of the rest. This is already begin to become an issue, but he says again the problems of affordability are a direct result of the failures of the Biden administration. And unfortunately, he says people aren't going to connect the dots. As I tried to explain the other day, when people say, well, inflation is up, yes, it's up 2 or 3%, but that's on top of when inflation was 9%. It's like a ratchet that keeps going higher and higher. Occasionally it drops for one reason or after another. One reason is if we have much more energy production, the cost of energy will go down, and so some prices will go down. But the bottom line is you're building inflation on past inflation most of the time, and that inflation comes because of all the money printing that has happened, because both Republicans and Democrats, both Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, have allowed us to spend much more than we bring in. It's back to my commentary today about the debt ratio. And so he says, look, if Republicans don't do things to lower the cost of living, I might add, if even elected Democrats right now in office don't do things to lower the cost of living, real things like cutting red tape, generating more electricity, not just for data centers, we'll come to that later, and getting rid of tariffs, yes, I know, he says, then expect to lose next year, because in some respects, no matter how much polling shows people agree with us on the so-called below-the-fold issues, not being able to afford to live will be more important whether or not you are allowing boys and girls sports or a variety of other things that we can talk about. So again, he says cutting tariff checks to everyone will not solve this problem. Tax cuts will not solve this problem. Plowing the road to get all the obstacles Bill government has put in our way will. But again, it's, I think, an illustration of what he is trying to communicate to some of these candidates right now, because we aren't negotiating with other countries when we go to the grocery store or pay our electric bills. We're trying to survive. And if we can't do that, nothing else matters, no matter how much you love it. And so he says, you know, whether it's elected officials or the president in the White House, can't convince people that things could be worse, because it's always hard to see that. But some form of affordability is the top issue in every poll. And if, again, candidates running in 2026 don't address this, nothing else will matter. So I think it's just a good illustration of the fact that it has been, I think, so typical sometimes of elected individuals to say, well, that affordability issue, that was kind of the theme. It was the buzzword for 2025, but it's not going to be that important in 2026. I think that it is. And we know why. As we've pointed out on this program before, if you look at some of the graphs and charts I've associated with my Viewpoints commentary, will show you that ever since we went off the gold standard in 1971, the cost of living kept going up, but when adjusted for inflation, wages stayed pretty horizontal, pretty static. And so the difference between what we make and what we need to make in order to support ourselves is very, very different. And so in some respects, that's why this affordability issue, which quite frankly was a big issue 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Democrats weren't really talking about it then, but it's certainly an issue that both Republicans and Democrats are talking about now. And if they don't, it will certainly have a very negative impact on the election less than a year from now. So I wanted to post that article, even though there's a little bit of rambling. I think this 4 pages could be summarized in 2 pages. I think I just did. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes I encourage you to get my Viewpoints commentary, because in less than 2 minutes, I try to tell you something significant about what's in the news. Anyway, let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One economic indicator that investors and average Americans consider is the nation's debt-to-GDP ratio. In previous commentaries, I've documented that once nations have surpassed 130% debt-to-GDP ratio, they eventually defaulted. I decided to dig a little deeper. I found that since 1800, there have been 51 out of 52 countries with a debt-to-GDP ratio this high that have defaulted. This was through restructuring, devaluation, high inflation, or outright default. Japan was the only exception in the past, but it's also fair to say that the U.S. is not that Japan, and even Japan today is not that Japan. Why am I talking about this now? Well, first, the current debt-to-GDP ratio is 125%. But it's worth noting that the ratio was over 130% in the second quarter of 2020 during the pandemic. Second, the U.S. debt is increasing faster than our economy. And a third reason is what happens today. The Federal Reserve has announced that it will end quantitative tightening on December 1st. It has been reducing its balance sheet. It is now going to pivot to quantitative easing, and that will likely begin to buy assets to increase the money supply. Let's go back to these historical examples. The odds aren't good for the U.S. since 98% of countries defaulted with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 130% or more. Now consider the fact that we just come off the longest government shutdown in American history because some in Congress wanted the government to spend more money on enhanced subsidies to Obamacare. Welcome to congressional irresponsibility. We're on the edge of a fiscal cliff, and many in Congress want to spend even more. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, we're talking about economics. Let's see if we can talk about socialism for just a minute, and then affluence, because we are living in an affluent society, and I think that will be illustrated by a very good piece by Kelsey Piper. But first of all, let's start with John Stossel. If you have not seen this is our second article, Thanksgiving Socialism. You can watch the video, and there's also a link there as well, because John Stossel reminds us in his piece called Thanksgiving Socialism that New York City just elected a proud socialist mayor. Seattle also elected a socialist mayor. And then he gives us a quote from the Student Life, a college newspaper, which said, "Let's give socialism a chance." Well, there's a reason why we don't want to give socialism a chance, and there's a reason why one of the upcoming issues of Outlook is on socialism. There's a reason why very shortly, if you haven't already received it, you received my particular booklet on the road to serfdom, which is, again, a summary of a very good book that critiques socialism, because there are reasons why we've tried to give socialism a chance, and it's failed. Again, in my booklet on socialism, I quote from Dinesh D'Souza, who gives us this long list, and there are about 24 countries that have all tried socialism, and they've all failed. But this piece by John Stossel reminds us something we talked about last week. 1 first with Bill, first of all, I should mention Bill Federer, first of all, and then even the week before, Jerry Newcomb. Both of them talked about the fact that we had this socialist experiment among the Pilgrims, and William Bradford saw that it was a disaster. He said few Pilgrims worked hard, claiming weakness and inability. Much of what was put in the common stores was stolen. So learning from their mistakes, William Bradford then gave every family a parcel of land, which then they could receive the benefits thereof, and the Pilgrims willingly went out into the field. He points out that once we had this idea of private property once again instituted, which you even find in the Old Testament, think about the land that was given to the 12 tribes and all of that, we see that again, private property works, and owning the means of production, which is Marxism, does not. And he points out that today Americans spend only 10% of our disposable income on food. He said, when I started working, it was twice that. And I'm going to be doing a commentary coming out where somebody, I think, completely misunderstood what the poverty level should be, but you can find that in an upcoming commentary in the Viewpoints commentary. But he says, we recognize that when we practice free markets, when we practice capitalism, when we actually allow people to receive the benefits of their hard labor because of private property rights, we benefit. And so stores compete with one another so that sometimes they're even selling turkeys at Thanksgiving at a loss just to get you to come through the door. Global competition lowers the price of airline tickets, which many people took so they could go and be with their families at the climate time. And at the Thanksgiving time, I should say. I was looking at climates here as well. And then also you can see the impact that this has had on other countries like Venezuela and Cuba, North Korea. The list is very long, and my booklet on socialism goes into that in some detail. And again, in Venezuela, every meal is a struggle. In Cuba, sometimes they have daily blackouts lasting up 20 hours, mounting piles of uncollected garbage, severe shortages of food and basic goods. So many things that I think we can learn from this, if you will, Thanksgiving socialist experiment that took place in 1620 and ended by 1621, because people need to have some incentive, and nothing provides more incentive than private property rights. Which brings me to a piece that I thought I'd mention real quickly. Jonah Goldberg is somebody that both Steve and I, my producer, and I both appreciate, and he mentioned a piece by Kelsey Piper. And I find myself quoting her from time to time. She's in her 30s, a graduate of Stanford, and she actually has written a piece called Medieval Kings Would Envy You. She talks about the fact that she lives in one of the wealthiest states in the wealthiest country in the world, because I assume she still lives over there in that area and knows a lot of CEOs in the nation's most expensive zip code. And so she talks about the fact that I'm surrounded by these individuals, but just come back to reality. Almost every single human who has ever lived, she says, was very poor. And so just for a minute, walk through my home and see how different my world is from the world not so long ago. He says, with them accompanying me, I walk through my house, and I try to see it through their eyes. Here is my tea cupboard, stuffered to the brim with packets and boxes that prevent the drawer from closing properly. I count 27 varieties of tea. I cringe at the 20 boxes of Celestial Seasons Mandarin orange spice that piled up because of an Amazon subscription I forgot to cancel. She talks about, I've accumulated more tea by accident than most people ever drank in their lives. Medieval kings, she said, would envy me. I turn to the left and see my bookshelves. When the Library of Congress was founded, it owned 740 books. I have much more. In 1815, after the British burned the library to the ground, Congress approved the purchase of Thomas Jefferson's entire, unusually comprehensive personal library. That amounted to 6,487 books. It cost them the inflation-adjusted equivalent of $500,000 or $80 a book, and compares that to getting some books online for $3 to $5. She says, I walked past glass windows, a luxury adornment for the homes of the ultra-wealthy since the time of Rome, though that's underselling modern windows. They weren't transparent back then. I meander past my closet, which contains more clothes than any 30 of my ancestors would have owned. I pass my refrigerator with all my ancestors who lived more than a century ago would take as flatly miraculous. And then there's my bathroom where hot water pours forever from the ceiling. I pay $1 for every 30 gallons of water that I use. When the White House was built, she said, it had no indoor plumbing. Flush toilets weren't introduced there until the 1840s. My ancestors weren't presidents, so they probably got them more recently. 1940 was the first census to find that more than half of American households had indoor plumbing. And then she goes on to talk about the fact that if you just compare ourselves to the kings, think of this. King James I and his wife had 7 children and buried 5. His son Charles and his wife had 9 children and buried 5. His son James had 8 children by his first wife and buried 6. Then had 7 children by his second wife and buried 5, not including several miscarriages and stillbirths. And then points out that if you look at the World Bank, the deadliest place to be born in the world is Niger in Africa, and yet here more than 1 in 10 die before age 5, but those odds are better than the children that 17th century English kings had. And then points out, as again we talk about food, in 1900 Americans spent nearly half, 43% of their income on food. Even this absurdity of a feast will not cost me half of my income for Thanksgiving week. And again, it's just a great illustration of all the things that changed in this amount of time. So again, we live in one of the most affluent countries, not only in the world, but in the most affluent civilization in history. And I recognize that affordability is an issue, which we just talked about a minute ago. But I think when we come back to this desire to try to make things better with socialism, maybe not such a good idea. We are the beneficiaries of private property rights. We're the beneficiaries of remarkable advances in science and medicine and technology. We're the beneficiaries of living in a relatively peaceful part of the world. The list goes on and on and on. And Kelsey Piper, I want to give her credit for this, reminds us that what we sort of just take for granted is something that would cause medieval kings to envy you. And the sermon yesterday that I heard from an individual that used to be at Watermark and then at City Bridge, but now is at Prestonwood Baptist Church, was about gratitude. And maybe at the end of this Thanksgiving week, a little bit of gratitude would be certainly appreciated and certainly appropriate, if for no other reason than we live a world that people that were the most affluent people in other centuries would never have been able to appreciate, and that's what we experience every single day. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll be right back.
No doubt you've seen the headlines and heard Kerby talking about Gen Z leading church attendance. It is so exciting to see young adults seeking truth. But there are a lot of lies that are competing for their attention and their hearts. The good news is you can give Americans the gift of truth. Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday, the perfect opportunity to make an intentional impact through your generosity. Every day, Point of View brings biblical truth to people across the nation and around the world, and your generous support is what makes that happen. Will you partner with Point of View this Giving Tuesday and give the gift of truth to a seeking nation? Don't forget to make your gift tomorrow or give anytime by visiting pointofview.org. or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. Again, Giving Tuesday coming tomorrow, but you can give right now at pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again this weekend for just a minute to talk about the Boy Scouts. And the reason for that is you may have heard that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War in the Trump administration, has proposed cutting the ties with Scouting America. Now, that is no longer the Boy Scouts, so maybe it's worth giving you a little bit of history to understand why he wants to do that. In 1910, the Boy Scouts were created, and it was at the very center of American life. And I've oftentimes used the Boy Scouts to illustrate that the Boy Scouts for many, many decades did not stray, but America did. I mean, when it was founded, the Boy Scouts of America were really the very center of American life, and they upheld the values that Americans felt were very important. And oftentimes said that if I were to see a resume which had somebody who was an Eagle Scout, I would know that this is an individual that had a great deal of drive, determination, certainly knew a lot about the world, had a level of integrity, and probably would be a very good worker. But as you may know, over time, the attacks intensified dramatically against the Boy Scouts, culminating in a Supreme Court decision in 2000, simply because the Boy Scouts wanted to maintain having male leadership that was not something that would deviate those boys from any kind of activity. And so they did not want to have homosexual leaders. And of course, that was a push from Lambda Legal and all the rest. And actually, by 2000, that was already beginning to end because the Levi Strausses of the world and all sorts of other corporations were pulling their funding. Within 2 years, they went bankrupt. And so then the decision was, we'll no longer have Boy Scouts of America, we'll have Scouting America, which I think Pete Hegseth is right. This is not the Boy Scouts that was endorsed by President Theodore Roosevelt. The organization, one endorsed by President Theodore Roosevelt, no longer supports the future of American boys. He talks about the organization being genderless and promoting diversity and inclusion and equity and all those kinds of things we've talked about before. And I think it just was an illustration of a couple of points. That is, that we still want the federal government to continue giving all sorts of benefits to an organization that does not exist. The Boy Scouts no longer exist, and yet there have been logistical and medical aid and all sorts of benefits going to the National Jamboree, which is a flagship event, which used to be of the Boy Scouts, now of Scouting America. Why give that privileged status there? But I think it illustrates again that there was a time in which, even though they were being attacked, the Boy Scouts stayed true, but eventually they caved, and you see what happened to the future of that. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why we sometimes do interviews with Trail Life is to provide that alternative, which we still think is very necessary. I saw Trail Life the other day put out a memo saying, we're teaching young boys about adventure rather than getting them involved in all sorts of gaming videos. And I thought that was really what we need to be doing. And I think Pete Hegseth is controversial for that, although as we will talk about tomorrow, we're going to spend some time talking about Venezuela, the drone strikes, narco-terrorism, and even the suggestion on the part of many Democrats in Congress that these actions would thus make Pete Hegseth war criminal. So we'll get into that tomorrow. And so in some respects, his bigger controversy hasn't to do with the Boy Scouts, but everything to do with what's going on right there in the Caribbean. But I thought we'd mention that just real quickly. And while I'm mentioning that, a good example of when you are digging a hole, the best thing to do is stop digging. Don't dig it deeper. As you may know, Jasmine Crockett the other day was in front of members of Congress saying that an individual who, by the way, runs the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Lee Zeldin, that Lee Zeldin had received contributions from Jeffrey Epstein. Except there's a problem with that. It's a lie. She did not actually do her homework, nor did her staff. This Dr. Jeffrey Epstein is no relationship at all to the pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. And so then, instead of saying, okay, made a mistake, she has been on the latest program, basically said, okay, I can agree that Lee Zeldin has said he didn't receive money from the Jeffrey Epstein, but I cleared the record, and it turns out that this was a donation that happened before the Jeffrey Epstein died, and that's wrong too. Talk about doubling down on stupid, doubling down on something that isn't working. She knows, and any source can tell you, that the donation from this physician named Jeffrey Epstein to Lee Zeldin took place, I think it was a couple of years after the other Jeffrey Epstein died. And so just a lesson for all of us: if you make a mistake, admit your mistake. The worst thing you can possibly do is, if you're digging a hole, keep digging. Not a good idea. But let's, if we can, go real quickly to a piece by Victor Davis Hanson. We oftentimes have conversations, usually with our Next Generation Roundtable. And this one, he's asking, can the lost generation be found? And he's talking about, of course, Generation Z, those individuals between ages 13 and 28. But he takes a different look at them than some of the things people are talking about, because he reminds us of how they have been, in many cases, especially the Generation Z males, have been demonized by hearing phrases about toxic masculinity at a time when the majority of students in college are female. In contrast, white males, 9 to 10% of admittees in some of our elite schools, are certainly dwindling dramatically because they're the wrong race, gender, sexual orientation. And he also points out that traditional pathways to adulthood, affordable homes, upwardly mobile, secure jobs, living in a safe and secure city, or suburban living, have mostly vanished because of overregulation, overtaxation, and under-policing. And even pointed out that during the Biden years, white males mostly stopped enlisting in the military, which is a place where they often spent. And then gets into the whole issue of the fact that we always hear that Generation Z doesn't date. And he points out that, again, some of that's due to these cultural messages. He says, soon young men feared sexual hookups or promiscuity as avenues to post facto and one-sided charges of harassment. For the half of the Generation Z who went to college, tuition has soared, rising faster than the rate of inflation. These individuals of Generation Z are mired with enormous student debt. Unemployed or half-employed as Generation Z ended up with unsustainable 5-figure student loans and insidious interest on them. And so he's really pointing out that sometimes we talk about the, if you will, the psychology, the psychodynamics of Generation Z, and that's important. But here he's talking about the demographic of issues and even the economic realities of some of that, as well as the false cultural messages that have actually had a negative impact on males, and maybe illustrated why some of them were so willing to follow a Charlie Kirk or a Jordan Peterson. And so he asked, what would shock the lost generation, Generation Z, back into the mainstream? And he says, well, one would be the end to DEI hectoring and blame gaming. Second, some sanity in the war between the sexes, he says. When women's represent nearly 60% of undergraduates, why does gender still assure an advantage in admissions and hiring? Number three, federal government needs to stop funding the student debt and maybe requiring universities to pledge their endowments to guarantee those loans. They'd be a lot more motivated to graduate individuals in 4 years. Number four, society needs to stop granting status on the basis of increasingly meaningless letters and titles after their name. And finally, we need to incentivize building homes rather than over-regulating and zoning them into unaffordability. It's a very different look at Generation Z. It's one that maybe we can encourage some of our participants in our Next Generation Roundtable to consider, because it is a reminder that some of these issues facing Generation Z were thrust upon them by politics, by economics, by a culture war, by even a war against boys that we've talked about here on Point of View. Fascinating article, once again, by Victor Davis Hanson. It's our third article. I would encourage you to read it from start to finish. Well written, as always. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and of course tomorrow we're going to get into some of these other issues in the news, especially what's going on with the United States and Venezuela. What does the Trump administration want to do? What are some of the criticisms coming? And we'll try to get into that and a little bit of a deep dive, because that is in the news and you deserve some answers to that as well. I'm going to try to give you the range of perspectives on that as well. So that's some things we'll be talking about tomorrow. Let me come back to an issue that we covered last week, and one I think we'll be covering time again, and that is, as we are in this world of the 250th anniversary, there have been some people that have wanted to produce very good programs, which we've pointed you to. Jerry Newcomb, I mentioned the other day that the Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch has a book coming out called The Heroes of 1776, and so that is helpful. But I have been struck by the number of individuals who have now been critical of Ken Burns, and I guess this is not anything new. Back in the spring, if you will, when they were talking about the shot heard around the world, that would be the Battle of Lexington and Concord, there were some videos that came out then about the way in which that was covered by Ken Burns. But now that you have the Ken Burns series on the American Revolution, I have been really just overwhelmed by the number of people that have taken to criticize some of the opening statements being made in his first episode. Now we have two, and if this is any preview of coming attractions, it is going to be one that is going to be criticized and vilified for some time. I mentioned Diane McLaughlin the other day. No, Ken Burns, the United States is not an Iroquois nation. He even went on to add in the subtitle, the founders didn't model us on the Six Nation, and George Washington didn't tomahawk a Frenchman. Rich Lowry, I think we did post that one. Ken Burns is completely wrong about the Iroquois. And then Matt Walsh, who's been on the program with us, produced a video exposing every lie in the Ken Burns anti-American documentary. I'm not trying to pile on Ken Burns. I've appreciated some of the things he's done in the Civil War, on jazz, on baseball, so many things. But I think it's a reminder that just because you see it on television or you read it in an article or a newspaper or a website doesn't necessarily make it true. And I'm kind of saddened about this because those of us that were around for the bicentennial in 1976, we had great patriotism, and I think we had very good educational programs that didn't have some of these historically flawed woke ideas in them. But that's all the more reason why I hope that you'll consider supporting Point of View, because we really believe it is going to be more important ever than to set the record straight. But I thought we'd end with a positive note, because we certainly have talked about this idea of the church calendar. And Wendell Vincent, in our last article here, says the first Sunday of Advent, yes, we're in the first Sunday of Advent, reminds us that hope is our calling even in the darkest times. He says, for those of you that aren't familiar with Advent, this first Sunday of Advent, you have the first candle, and that is the Advent wreath. It's often referred to as the hope candle. It also is sometimes referred to, if you're familiar with this, as the prophet's candle. But again, the name really adds, as he says, depth and richness. It's named the prophet candle because of the Old Testament prophets who were faithfully waiting for the Messiah. Their stories add context to the kind of hope this candle represents. It is a patient hope, a hope that endures in the face of suffering. Above all, it is a hope that will be realized. That's what we remember on that Sunday that just passed, and why we light the wreath every year. It's not just a tradition, it's a reminder that light will overcome darkness. He gives this wonderful little statistic note, and I'm well aware of it, because he says in a study published in the MIT Technology Review, researchers found that the human eye can see a single candle flame in just over 1.7 miles away. Oftentimes when I speak on creationism to some of these kids in Oregon in this Bible school, I talk about the wonders of our eyes, our ears, our brain, and one of the things I quote is the statistic about the fact that in a dark night you can see a candle more than a mile away. And so the point he's making is that even a small, solitary candle can stand against incredible darkness. I know some of our listeners perhaps have been into one of those caves where if you go underground and go into a cave, they turn off all the lights. You can't even see your hand in front of your face. But if somebody lights a lighter or lights a candle, you can see incredibly. And the point he's making is this is true about our hope for the world. Hope, like light, he said, is more powerful than the darkness of evil. That's why the Apostle John uses the imagery of light and darkness in the opening verses of his gospel, saying, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And so it's, I think, helpful during this year in which we've had difficulties and hardships and certainly all the negative things I certainly find myself having to talk about here on Point of View, just if we come back to this time of Advent to maybe recognize the hope that comes there as well. And then, because he works with various ministries in the California area, he gives some examples, and one of those is where CityServe was actually reaching out, providing life coaching and job skills and training for individuals. And he remembers that one graduate read a poem, and one of the phrases out of the poem really reflected what he wanted to talk about. You are vessels of hope. And so during this first Sunday of Advent, during this Advent season, he says, these words remind us that hope isn't simply an idea. It's a tangible idea embodied in action. It meets people wherever they are on their journey. And so he reminds us that, again, the hope of the Messiah to come and rescue his people in an imperfect world isn't just something we read about each Christmas season. It can be a daily reality proven over and over again around the world, where we find a way to help fix what is broken. We do this not in our own power, but as people reflecting the light of the greatest hope of all mankind, Jesus Christ. Because of him, our hope incarnate, we can be light in the darkness and persevere in the face of evil for the good of our neighbor. It is into that most holy work that we are invited, not just this Advent season, but every day of our lives. So if nothing else, just a reminder that as we are in the period of Advent, maybe we can once again reflect on the hope that we can bring to the world. We hope that this has been an encouragement to you. One more time, let me mention that Giving Tuesday is tomorrow. You can, of course, respond right now by clicking on that button and help us meet our goal. And if you've appreciated some of the conversation that we've had around this table, we certainly would appreciate your particular gift. And if you find yourself saying you would like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've discussed, we have all of that information on our website. Not only information about the book, The Heart of Apostasy, but these 4 different articles that I mentioned in this second hour as well. Most importantly, just want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Visit the website. We have our Giving Tuesday banner up there, my Viewpoints commentary. And if you'd like to listen to anything again, click on that button that says Watch or Listen, because we certainly want to be an encouragement to you. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.